All right. Hi again, everyone. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. We're really glad you could be with us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, for our webinar today on supporting youth and students experiencing homelessness in the COVID-19 crisis. This is an issue that affects over 1.5 million students. We know it is an issue that is expected to grow as we've been tracking different efforts in philanthropy over these early months of the COVID crisis. We've seen a real focus on basic needs. That points to food insecurity, worries about food insecurity. It points to safety, and it also, of course, points to housing insecurity. And so this is an opportunity for all of us to learn about how different organizations are making connections to students who are experiencing homelessness and how philanthropy can help. So we've got a really great group today. I learned a lot from them on the prep call. So we've got Zoe Stemm-Calderon and Casey Truppen from the Rakes Foundation. We've got Barbara Duffield from SchoolHouse Connections, Daniel Zavala, and Liz Burrell from Building Changes. So I'm going to turn it over to Zoe to start us off with some framing on the work at Rakes and how it connects to this.
Thank you, Celine, and thanks so much for hosting this webinar on such a critical topic before the crisis, and certainly now more than ever with the public health and financial crisis that we're facing in our country. You know, it's funny, I came to Rakes Foundation 5 years ago to lead the education team, and it's where I began working alongside our team led by Casey Truppen that's focused on youth and young adult homelessness. And it's, you know, as someone who's been a teacher and an instructional coach and a district leader for most of my career, I'm sort of embarrassed to say that I hadn't thought about homeless students as deeply as I should have until I came to Rakes. And it's been in education, working alongside my colleagues and their partners focused on youth homelessness. You know, things like relationships with youth advocates that helped me see that sort of what was in my blind spot about both the resilience and the needs of students experiencing homelessness have really sort of transformed my understanding. I think exposure to the evidence base about approaches that educators can take to support students towards stable housing and towards academic success have really made me recognize there's much more in our zone of control as educators to support students who are experiencing homelessness. And then just learning about the policies that protect our students' rights and afford them critical supports sort of alerted me to my responsibility as an educator, a responsibility I don't think I'd fully grasped when I was in practice or supported educators I worked with to really fulfill. So over time, sort of working across our education work and our work focused on youth and young adult homelessness, I think I've shifted from seeing homeless students as a small population that we can address through sort of general strategies and approaches targeted at low-income students to actually really understanding the specific needs of students who are experiencing homelessness, and that if we understood those better and we prioritized those needs more, we could build schools and systems that were just better designed for all of our students. And then COVID happened. And I think we can just all see more clearly what a critical platform schools are for stability, for connectedness, and support for basic needs. I think we can all also see how hard learning from home is when you don't have stable housing, as we just grapple with the basics of connectedness for students. And so I'm just really grateful to be on this call with all of you, and thanks to everyone who's shown up to learn more about the needs of homeless students in this moment and how you can use your grant making and your voice to make a difference. So I appreciate you sort of getting deeper on this learning journey along with all of us.
So why don't we start, so let me just kind of lay out the day. So we're going to have a little bit of a research grounding for those of you like Zoe and myself who have backgrounds in education, but have less of a background in homeless students and the unique issues facing that group. We want to do a research-based framing. We'll have some kind of Q&A, and we welcome anyone at any time to throw questions into the chat box around what are some of the lessons we're seeing, what are some of the trends, what are some of the gaps, Then we're going to kind of move back to listening to our panelists talk about kind of where do we go from here, and what is the future that we foresee, as we're all in the business now of prognosticating about what the fall and future will look like. And then we're going to devote the last 20 minutes just to your questions in the audience. So why don't we turn it over now to Barbara?
Great. Thank you very much. So we're going to start the research grounding part of the webinar by looking at some of the data we have at the national level and then looking at Washington State as well. So what you have on this slide here is the top bullet is really starting the 2017-2018 school year. So pre-COVID, 1.5 million students. A little bit of context about that. That was the highest number on record. Also, it represents an 11% increase over the previous year, in part because of the affordable housing crisis, deep pockets of poverty, opioids, methamphetamines, a number of different localized factors, but also we think to a certain extent, some schools doing a better job of actually identifying and finding students experiencing homelessness. So a number of different factors, but again, record levels of homelessness pre-COVID. That also is true for young children. The U.S. Department of Education also estimates how many children under the age of 6 experience homelessness by looking both at preschool data from school districts as well as the early childhood programs within HHS. That number 2 is the highest on record, or was the highest on record pre-COVID. In terms of the impacts of homelessness on educational outcomes, we now, thanks to ESSA, do have disaggregated graduation rates for students who are experiencing homelessness. And the most recent national high school graduation rate, as you can see on the slide, is well below other students who are low income and significantly below all students. The point here is that homelessness has an impact on academic achievement that is over and above poverty. The high rates of mobility, the trauma that leads to homelessness and is the result of homelessness all create tremendous educational challenges, both to accessing education, participating, and being able to be successful. So there's an educational imperative around homelessness above and beyond all the other surrounding factors. The other thing we know, and is really critical to keep in mind, is that harmful impact on academic achievement persists even after students are housed. We have research from EdTrust New York and from ICPH in New York City looking at academic performance of formerly homeless students, and we see gaps there too. So there's a lingering impact because of the trauma on academic achievement for students who are experiencing homelessness. And then lastly, just in terms of the connection, the interconnection between homelessness and high school graduation, we now know from research at the University of Chicago that the lack of a high school degree and GED is the single greatest risk factor associated with homelessness as a young adult. So there's a bi-directional relationship of homelessness creating challenges for achieving academically, but also that educational degree is a protective factor against future homelessness. So we need to zero in really on the prevention piece, the protective piece of public schools and what they can do. And I'll turn it over now to my colleagues at Building Changes to say what that looks like at the state level in Washington.
Thanks, Barbara. This is Liza Burrell from Building Changes. So I just wanted to share a little bit of a Washington State snapshot. In Washington State, we are really fortunate to have engaged Philanthropy, like the Rakes Foundation, who's on this call with us, focused on this issue, and they support, along with other philanthropic partners, the SchoolHouse Washington project, which is really the project that Daniel and I will focus on today. We're really fortunate. As part of that project, we have a data sharing agreement with our state education agency. So we're able to do some of that deep data dives that Barbara was talking about at the national level too. So we get a data set every year from our state education system. And we now have it for 4 prior school years that allows us to track and compare student outcomes over time to see how our state is doing for our students experiencing homelessness. So what we know, much like what Barbara shared, is that student homelessness in Washington State is on the rise. It's actually about twice what it was 10 years ago. For the last academic year, we have data, which is 2017-18. We have over 40,000 students in our state experiencing homelessness. Through the data set that I was talking about, we're able to do a deeper dive, and what we've learned and have been able to share with our state is that 60 or 6 out of 10 of those students, 60% or 6 out of 10 of those students are students of color. And what we also know is of those students of color, specifically our Black, African American, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, and American Indian Alaskan Native students have experienced the largest increase in the student homelessness rate since 2015. We also are able to see that this is a full state issue. This impacts our rural communities and our urban communities as well as suburban communities. What we know is that though the highest number of students experiencing homelessness are in our urban areas, the highest rate of students experiencing homelessness are actually in our rural areas. So we've actually used this at our state level to really engage a lot of our elected leaders who are maybe in those more rural communities to help them understand that this is really a statewide issue. And about 40,000 students is about one per classroom, which is, if we just take a step back and think about that, like that's an enormous amount of young people who are experiencing instability and high mobility. We do have a bright spot that we wanted to share, which is our graduation rate. The graduation rate for students experiencing homelessness is improving in our state. It moved from 50% in 2015 up to 56% in 2018, which is super exciting. Unfortunately, our students do still fall behind their housed peers who are graduating at a rate of 83% and still far behind where we'd love all of our students to be at 100%, of course. I do also want to share that this data set allows us to really look at how our students of color experiencing homelessness are faring as compared to their white peers, as well as our students experiencing homelessness as compared to their housed but low income peers, which is something that Zoe alluded to in her introduction. It's an opportunity and it's a great learning for us to really recognize that this is not just a story of poverty or income, it's a story of high mobility and trauma. We use this analysis to engage people and increase awareness for advocacy and identify the needs and opportunities for targeted support. If you want to see more of what we've been able to analyze and see the opportunity that could exist in your communities, please check out our website, which is linked here. And with that, I will pass it back to Barbara.
Okay. So as also just by way of framing and setting out the context, oftentimes when we talk about students experiencing homelessness, to educators or a general audience, their first response is, well, where are they? I don't see them. It's a very invisible population. So we just want to take a second here to say that in the public education context, the legal definition of homelessness includes children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And you can see on the pie chart, this is data reported by public school districts and charter schools to the U.S. Department of Education and reflects where children and youth were staying when they were initially identified as experiencing homelessness. So you can see the greater part of the pie chart is children and youth who are staying with other people temporarily, sometimes called doubled up. This is because shelters are full. There may be rules at shelters. Shelters may not exist in rural areas. So it's a very hidden population, but comprises the majority. And the other categories are perhaps a little bit more self-evident in terms of what homelessness looks like. The other piece I'd like to add, just by way of context, is that these are not static groups. Children and youth who are experiencing homelessness move between them very frequently over the course of the school year. So there's a lot of fluidity. And of course, school districts know this better than anybody else because they're rerouting the buses, or they were rerouting the buses, and continually seeing children and youth going from car to couch to motel, maybe a shelter, back to another couch. So this is really kind of what we're looking at. And again, it's the same definition, whether we're talking early childhood, K-12, or higher ed. Next slide.
Barbara,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you have anything to add on this topic about how this data disaggregates by race.
There is not yet national data on the disaggregation of race in terms of the K-12 data. However, we do have from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is part of the CDC, looking at high school students, and we've done an analysis of the homelessness questions in 17 states and see, similar to Washington State, a very significant higher risk of homelessness, higher rate of homelessness for Black students, for Hispanic students. And there isn't a question yet on Native, but there's other research that indicates a very disproportionate rate of homelessness among American Native as well. Next slide, please. By way also of context, just what is the existing infrastructure and current educational protections? I'll just give a broad brush and then again turn it over to Washington, to Building Changes and Schoolhouse Washington, to talk about what that looks like in Washington State. But the main vehicle for both service delivery and for educational protections is the McKinney-Vento Act, which has been around for quite a while now. The very last slide in the deck is kind of a timeline for those of you who may be interested in how this has sort of evolved over the past 30 years. But this is the primary legislation that was reauthorized by Every Student Succeeds Act, and before that by NCLB, that requires a liaison in every local educational agency, as well as a state coordinator. That liaison is responsible for many things: the professional development and training, coordination of services, identification, and has some specific responsibilities for young children and for unaccompanied youth. The Act also requires proactive identification. This is one of the pieces that really was bolstered in the last reauthorization, because we know children and youth who are homeless it's so challenging to find them, and if we don't know who they are, we can't ensure their protections. Also, school stability, knowing that school may be and often is the only stable place in a child's life, so that ability to stay in the same school, get transportation to stay in the same school, so you have an oasis of continuity for people and for learning. And then immediate enrollment. The rules that make sense for enrolling students with permanent stable housing will be barriers for children and youth who don't have stable housing and who are moving from place to place and may lack records, or if they're unaccompanied youth, proof of guardianship. And then again, some pieces on the bookends on early childhood and higher ed. These basic protections in the McKinney-Vento Act have made their way into other educational statutes over the years, including Title I Part A, IDEA, Head Start, CCDF, higher ed. So lots of ways in which over the course of time, through advocacy and strong supporters in Congress, federal education and early care law has been McKinney-Ventoized to recognize the unique challenges that these children and youth face.
And in the Washington context, I think it's really helpful to note that, like, while there is this law, there's a requirement that we need funding to support the implementation of this done well. And so in Washington State, we get about $1.5 million from the federal government through our McKinney-Vento funding. About a little over $1 million actually gets granted out to districts. As Barbara had mentioned, right, the state education agency retains a portion of that funding for their state coordinator and other services that might be provided. In Washington State, as I kind of mentioned, only about 20% of our school districts get some sort of funding, either through McKinney-Vento or our kind of state program we call the Homeless Student Stability Program. And so as you see there, not only is it kind of not reaching all of the districts, and what you'll actually note is within each of the districts, it's actually not sufficient as well. And while we have the McKinney-Vento program dollars, we also in our state have something pretty unique called the Homeless Student Stability Program. And it was done through a recognition that we wanted to kind of bolster school and housing provider partnerships. And so it is administered both through our state education agency at our state called the Office of the Superintendent for Public Instruction, as well as the Department of Commerce. And in that partnership, again, it was kind of meant to focus on school partnerships with housing providers focused on student stability for homeless students. When we look at our kind of homeless student stability program, the important thing to note in here is that we actually get more money through this program than we do through the federal McKinney-Vento program. We do it biannually, and it gets about $4 million each biennium. And again, that's split through the two different state agencies. We are able to actually administer a number of these grants directly to school districts, and then also through the Department of Commerce funding, we do it to a number of other providers that can do housing stability. And then the other thing to note in terms of the infrastructure in Washington State is through our Department of Commerce, we actually have an Office of Homeless Youth, which is fairly unique to our state, and then the ability to actually focus on unaccompanied youth and young adults, and also, with the Homeless Student Stability Program, homeless students. And as I kind of note, either that we have the federal law and how it's implemented at our state level. We have state agencies through our education agency and our Department of Commerce, all focused on this. What we noticed in our state and kind of where our organization and our partners and Philanthropy has really noticed is that there wasn't kind of this cohesion and coalescing around a North Star. And so through that is really where the SchoolHouse Washington project was born. was to kind of give some coordination and direction to the space in general around advocacy. And so as part of that, we have actually outlined what we're dubbing the Schoolhouse Promise, which is actually an aim to get everyone on the same goal of graduating 90% of our students experiencing homelessness by 2027, aligning that with another state goal that we have for all students. And then other things that we've done to kind of coalesce people is to provide a menu of strategies. So a list of kind of recommendations and practices that are derived from our schools across the state and intended to be kind of shared with our state education agency, with our school districts and providers across the state. And again, kind of all for the aim of getting towards this one singular goal. And then while we've kind of focused on kind of the implementation of practice, one of the other things that we noticed was the need to have an advocacy arm focused on our highly mobile student population. And so in partnership with others that are focused on youth and foster care, we created in the last couple of years, the Project Education Impact Work Group. And what that work group does is take nonprofit partners as well as state agencies to work together toward that common goal of increasing academic outcomes for our highly mobile students, including students experiencing homelessness. And this last year, we actually bolstered that bill to make sure that it included legislative members as well. Next slide.
Can I just pause you for 1 second, Daniel? So we did have a question on McKinneyVento, and how does that look for homeless youth attending higher education, and do the resources that the student receives in K through 12 transfer to college? So maybe while we're on that slide, we can just throw in that one question.
Sure. Should I start and then turn it over to our partners? Okay. So there is not yet a McKinneyVento system in the higher ed world. At the national level. We would very much like that to be. It's a big push in our legislative advocacy for the Higher Education Act. A number of states have adopted the liaison type model of having a single point of contact or a higher ed liaison, some by state law. For example, Maine and Tennessee just passed state laws last year to require a liaison in higher education for students experiencing homelessness. But right now, really what we have is the K-12 system sort of feeding in to the higher education system. That's the pipeline for student homelessness, and requirements on the school district liaison to help with the FAFSA. And we have provisions within the FAFSA for particularly for youth who are homeless and on their own, but there hasn't been that sort of robust kind of overall McKinney-Ventoization yet on higher ed. The basic needs movement in higher education has been helpful, but it's obviously very large and comprises many different student groups. Youth experiencing homelessness more akin to students in foster care, so needing more than just sort of housing and food, but needing a lot of other supports in terms of trauma and connection as well. So that's sort of where we are at nationally.
And this is Liza. We're not much different in Washington State, frankly. I love the idea of doing a liaison at the higher ed, so now I'm going to look into those states.
Yeah, but I think the question raises, and I think what Barbara and Liza are pointing to is this kind of, there's this huge drop off that we see, not only around graduation, right? And I think that's what we were talking about when Liza was mentioning some of those stats around graduation, but also that transition to post-secondary spaces. And so for us, that's a big point of focus around that transition of how do you get folks who have graduated into that post-secondary space. And I know within our state, we have a number of different programs where we are trying to take into account, homeless students and homeless student supports at that post-secondary level.
Great. So Daniel, I know I interrupted you, so go ahead to the next section on COVID-19 impact. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I'll kick it back to Barbara to start at the national context.
Okay. So I think just again, by way of framing, to understand the impact of COVID-19 is also to understand what school was when school was in session for students who are experiencing homelessness. That place that was safe, that was stable, where there are adults checking in on you. So yes, the education, which is the key to lasting pathways out of homelessness, but just to understand exactly what that was in that environment. In the initial weeks after the outbreak, we surveyed our national network of school districts and other providers. The challenges are listed on the slide. We are repeating this survey every 2 weeks just to keep apprising of things change, but staying in contact. The mobility for families who are homeless and mobile before are even more mobile now. Many of the families and youth who were staying with other people were asked to leave. I was just on a call previously with family service providers who were seeing a tremendous explosion because of that particular piece. So increases in mobility, and then the challenges that school districts have staying in touch with young people and with families, the basic needs issues, tremendous. Again, there was a lot of interest and coverage around the food challenges, and it's taken schools a while to understand that some families or youth without transportation will need delivery that may change on a regular basis. Again, the safety issues for children and youth who are now staying in places that were never meant to be where they were supposed to be all day long. So those safety issues and the shelter issues as well. Students who can't self-isolate, they cannot maintain social distancing. So school districts and communities struggling to figure out how to help them do that in terms of their housing situation. Distance learning, many of the issues around devices and connectivity and places to charge devices when there is no mall, no library, no cafe that you can do that. But then again, also kind of the learning environment is, even if you have all of those, if you don't know where you're going to stay next, or there's people coming in and out of where you're staying, being able to focus on your studies. And again, this last piece, which is probably the one that we are hearing the most about now, which is just tremendous anxiety about what's to come with the waves of homelessness when the eviction moratoria are no longer in place. Even recognizing students and families, many are not protected by that now, trying to figure out what that's going to look like. So students who've experienced trauma in the past are now doubly and triply traumatized, and schools are really still on the front lines. I think that's the other piece too. The liaison requirement is still in place. McKinneyVento cannot be waived. So the law's in place, the protections are in place, it's being carried out very differently. The last bullet, what we have done is really collect all the questions. So our frequently asked questions document is verbatim questions from educators, the actual questions that we try to answer with guidance and law, but also crowdsourcing with local best practices, as well as kind of creating tools to replicate. So that's what we're seeing right now. The impact is really devastating in ways that really can't even be articulated, and that we are still learning.
And Barbara, a quick clarifying question from the audience. So you're surveying LEA, so I would assume district leaders there. You're talking to educators. There's a question about are homeless youth included in any of your surveys? How is their voice incorporated, if at all?
Sure. Well, the surveys are to people in our network, so prior to their providers, either educators or service providers on the front lines. We do also have a youth leadership and scholarship program. So we are working with over 100 young people in various stages from high school to college, and have tapped their knowledge, had them do a webinar, for example, on what their current needs are, have them co-write some of our publications. They're working now on a student-facing part of our website. So through our youth leadership and scholarship program is where we've really tried to directly get youth voice involved in our COVID response. The piece that's missing, though, I'll say, is parents. I don't think we've had great connectivity with parents who are going through this right now.
Thanks.
So in Washington, I think we did a little bit of that research grounding at the beginning, kind of talking about the state of things and how, as compared to their house peers, homeless students are performing significantly lower. And since mid-March, things have definitely changed for all of us nationally, and certainly so as Barbara kind of outlined around the impact for students experiencing homelessness. And since mid-March, our entire state has been, doing this remote learning environment. And really one of the things that we would look for in that environment is state education agency guidance on kind of best practices, implementation, some of the things that Barbara had mentioned around identifying those who maybe become homeless after school closures, what distance learning could look like. And we have state guidance on students with disabilities, English language learners, migrant students, but we don't have any guidance on how to best educate homeless students at this time. And so that's one of the things that we have been talking about with our state education agency as a need. One of the things that our state has done, though, is mandated district surveys weekly. And so our districts are actually kind of doing some self-reported surveys back to our state education agency, where they're talking about some of the needs that they're having around around communication, basic needs, and distance learning. And so that has been somewhat informative to kind of just provide the state of things for this, our state education agency, but there hasn't been any action taken in terms of, okay, great, now that we've learned this, here's what we're going to do. We have seen some good state examples around guidance, and I know that one of the things that we've talked about amongst ourselves is Ohio, and the fact that Ohio has actually issued good state guidance around educating students experiencing homelessness at this time. One of the things that we wanted to do, though, while the state is mandating these district surveys, they don't get into kind of the granular details of homeless students. And so we actually sent a survey to all the McKinneyVento liaisons across the state. We heard back pretty broadly in terms of geographic representation, heard back about 25% of our school district, from about 25% of our school districts, and 32 of the 39 counties in our state. So again, broad geographic reach with that survey. And fairly similar to what Barbara had kind of outlined in her survey, what we're hearing in terms of our top 5 needs are food, so basic needs, mobile hotspots and internet access, technology devices, so again, access to education, hygiene supplies, and rental assistance. And one of the things that we've been able to actually do with this survey, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, is actually not just take the information and share that, but actually try and translate that into recommendations for what our school districts can be doing, and importantly, what our state can be doing to best support students experiencing homelessness right now. And then the other thing that we have actually transitioned since COVID-19 has impacted our students is that we convene a school housing network that includes housing providers as well as district McKinneyVento liaisons. Again, kind of under that same kind of guise of the Homeless Student Stability Program, right? Matching school district personnel with housing providers to best support students. And while the focus has always been on kind of best practices, what we've done since COVID-19 is actually convene that group, particularly around COVID-19 and how to best support students at this time, but also increase the frequency of that. And really that's kind of come at the request of the participants wanting to peer learn and peer workshop with each other practices. And I think actually that brings us to kind of our grounding and our context. And actually I think to kick this back to you.
Yeah, so this is great. So I love a session that has a lot of questions all throughout. So thank you all so much for your questions already. If you haven't noticed, we have a very active chat box with a ton of different resources, both from our partners on this call, as well as from other places. And so please take a look at those and we can send them out afterward. Now is the time when we formally move into questions. And so keep throwing them at me and I will keep feeding them to our panelists. But I'd love to start by asking, so you all have a proximity that many of us on this call don't. I would love to hear, just walk us through kind of a day in the life of a McKinneyVento liaison right now. What are they seeing on the ground? What are they doing? How are they having to pivot from the day-to-day when students were in physical schools to now?
Okay, I guess I'll start. The day-to-day is, again, largely, in the initial phases still was largely around basic needs, or was about basic needs. It is still that. Oftentimes what we see is, or what we're hearing is that one issue will be solved and then another one will come up. So for example, okay, great, we've got food distribution sites, but now we've got families who have extra needs. We have to figure out how to get it there. We have to figure out how to get it there safely. The same thing with connectivity, like, great, we've got hot spots, but what about our rural areas? There's not even a signal, so are we going to go to hard copy there? So it's every day is troubleshooting a new challenge and understanding that the mobility is one of the biggest challenges. So the family whose phone was on today is now off tomorrow. And do we have a second contact? And do we have a third contact? And how do we reach that person? So that whole global piece about identification and connecting to basic needs is very much still there. I was speaking to a liaison from York County, Pennsylvania the other day, and she sort of wrote out their whole kind of everything that's happened. And, there were now families in campgrounds and youth in campgrounds. And so she is literally going there with her phone and turning her phone on as the Wi-Fi. So she is the device, she is the connectivity, she is the teacher, she is the school going to where students are. So again, it looks very different, but that's just a little bit of a flavor nationally.
Yeah, we're hearing much the same. Outreach is a huge, it's a huge piece of their job, generally speaking. And right now, because of physical distancing, it's really been much more complicated. And frankly, I think our liaisons are getting various messages from their own school districts. So every school district is different, and how their liaisons are able to work is different, which is really one of the challenges we have in Washington State.
And I imagine, go ahead,
Sorry,
Liza.
go ahead.
I was going to say, and I imagine things are different from the younger grades to the much later grades in who you're communicating with and how that's going.
Very definitely. I was just going to say, like when the rule that you one device per family, and then you've got children with different ages trying to access one device. So that's one piece. And then families who are split up because of the housing situation. So we have family, that's another dynamic where the parent may not actually be with them.
I think one other thing to note in all of this, right, is kind of how things are different in, the day of the life of a liaison, is that this, the COVID pandemic has underscored the importance of the school building as a resource, as kind of this stable foundation for not only students, but also for staff and administering those services. And so one of the things that we are continually hearing is just the difficulty in providing those services, whether they be basic needs services right around hygiene supplies or food, but again, the access to education, again, around like hotspots or technology, but then also just the importance of that stable place in a student's life. And so that's one of the things that we're consistently hearing from school personnel as well, as they think about kind of what lies ahead in the future of, there are some student populations, students experiencing homelessness being one of them, that really do require that stable school site in order to receive those quality education services. And I think while that might have kind of anecdotally or even just, been known kind of within those who are working with students experiencing homelessness, like it has become so much more widespread in terms of awareness for the education kind of ecosystem, that school site really serving as a resource hub is critical.
I think that makes a ton of sense, both the physical site and then also school as a source of nutrition and food. And I want to drill down on a question related to food and basic hygiene supplies. So philanthropy is uniquely positioned to move quickly in a crisis and fill gaps. And so we know from our own research at GFE that many funders jumped right into that basic needs gap in the early days of the crisis, but also recognized that nutrition supports were actually provided for schools through government funding. And so there is a question when you hear 2 months or 3 months in, depending on how you count, that food still rises toward the top of the list for people about how are these systems working together? Where is philanthropy? Where are government sources? And where are the gaps that still need to be worked out?
Go ahead, Barbara, and then maybe I'll jump in around Washington.
What I would just say is that one of the gaps is flexible funding to meet some of the challenges that come up. So one of the big things that we hear from school district liaisons is, depending on their state guidance, depending on the school district guidance, can we use our federal dollars for gift cards, which can be delivered electronically, which can be used for any number of different things. And some states say yes, and some states say no. So it's an example of kind of a real practical gap where the schools know who needs them and know how to deliver them, but how to do that depending on their restrictions is very significant. So that's just one piece that I was going to offer.
Yeah, and I think the only maybe 2 points that I'll add is not only is it the flexibility, but it's also the speed. Governments, as probably most folks on this phone know, tend to perhaps be overly deliberative, overly kind of plan and try and create, the one size fits all. And maybe that's, but all that's to say is that like philanthropy has actually really been able to kind of step in where government has really dragged its feet. And so while our state is still trying to figure out how to administer funds that have been available from the federal government now, that philanthropy stepped in immediately, right? And I think to the point around, basic needs is those are things that are on a daily basis needing to be replenished and available. So that's certainly kind of the point I would make there. And then I've totally blanked on the other one, so maybe it'll come back to me.
And I would say, I would add that districts are doing really creative things around basic needs. It's just, again, going back to not every district is, and not every McKinney-Vento liaison has the capacity to do that. So going back to like the flexibility need, I have learned, I do not come from an education background like probably most people on this call do, and I have learned a tremendous amount about, it might just be Washington State specific, but how every school district is different. And so you can't, like what one school district, though unfortunately every school district has students whose needs are unmet, but they're being either met differently or not met at all. So I think having philanthropy be able to respond very quickly has been really, really effective in our state. Though, as Daniel said, and I'll talk about a little later, leveraging that to tell government what really is needed is the step that we now absolutely must do.
I remember what I was going to say real quick. It was just also that in the education space in particular, government is, really kind of gotten it down to a science of how to deliver funds to districts. But when we recognize with students experiencing homelessness is those services are provided by a much broader range of entities, including nonprofit organizations. And so when we think about the philanthropic sector, that is one big value add, is that that philanthropy is often kind of much more willing or able or structured to provide that funding to the nonprofit or just even non-school district partners that provide services to students experiencing homelessness in a way that government is not set up.
That's helpful. So I have one more question in this stage, and maybe the building changes folks can focus on Washington State, and maybe Barbara, you can focus more nationally, but give us a highlight. What are some things that are being learned in this stage? Give us an example of something that is going well and what it might look like in this very, very challenging moment where we know that things are very, very difficult for a lot of people. Give us something, some moment of hope.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could start with Washington and then we'll end with the national context. I think, I mean, one of the things here, right, and I think we often can talk about the urgency and the dire nature of what's happening, and I think because that's very real, and frankly, that's what's being experienced by the majority of students right now. But to your point, like there are bright spots and there actually are kind of positive stories that we're hearing, and one of them is that staff, schools, and districts are incredibly creative in a time of crisis. I mean, frankly, in general, but certainly right now in a time of crisis. And what we're seeing is, to Barbara's story, right? When she talked about Pennsylvania, like someone driving out to say, use my phone as a hotspot, right? Like we're seeing examples of that where schools are kind of opening up, saying, Boys and Girls Club, come and use our cafeteria for childcare, because we recognize, how important that is right at a time right now. And so I think we're actually seeing kind of a bunch of bright spots and these one-off examples. And frankly, it just underscores the importance of talking to providers, of talking to communities around kind of what are the solutions to how to address the problem right now. Because while, the state can think about a uniform infrastructure to be implemented statewide, like the actual solutions themselves really do need to be driven up from local communities. And so I can kind of give a little laundry list, but I think it was just more just the context of what's happening in Washington. Of, yeah, I mean, we are seeing like local districts provide, just really unique ways of delivering different technology or doing childcare through that. Food delivery has even become kind of something that school districts have become incredibly clever and creative in providing.
Oh, that was good. You gave me time to think of couple bright spots. But there are many different bright spots, and I think the convening, the way that Washington State has convened and the way that we've tried to convene people is really where those ideas kind of can percolate and replicate when people get together and hear those ideas. So some of the things, for example, buses with Wi-Fi going out, that happened and people hear about it, then it also happened. But in Frederick County, Maryland, a nonprofit organization is working with the public schools where the school social workers are doing the outreach to McKinney-Vento families and youth, finding out what they need. And then the nonprofit organization has a fulfillment form on its website so they can use that. They're the fulfillment system for whatever the school district identifies as the needs for the children to use. So that partnership has been really very positive. And then on the younger side, a few states, and I don't know how many, have listed homelessness as part of their eligibility for emergency childcare. So their childcare is emergency for essential workers, but they've also added at-risk children, including children experiencing homelessness. So in the case of North Carolina, they've done that, and that means that children have a safer place to be during the day and a quieter place to focus on their academics because they actually have access to those childcare spaces. So there's a couple examples.
That's really helpful. So
Can I just add one more? I know but sort of a big, like pulling back big picture bright spot is that we're talking about students experiencing homelessness and webinars and to new audiences, including this one right now. I think that this crisis is also shining a light for many in our country about the lack of infrastructure, the lack of support that many people experience. So I just wanted to highlight that we're here now, and part of that is because of COVID, because of this crisis and getting this awareness out to more people.
I think that's exactly right. And that's why we're going to turn to Casey Trupin, who's been at this for a while and thinking about how philanthropy can support homeless youth. And so Casey, I'd love for you to point us in the direction of where do we go from here, specifically for an audience of folks in philanthropy. And what do you see as the next set of stages and where philanthropy can help?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Celine. I think in thinking about this question, trying to think about how the Rakes Foundation has responded and the struggles that we're having, and I think the successes that we're having in really through our partners. I think the initial thing that we did in responding was to, with Building Changes, launch a fund to get philanthropic funds out to students and youth experiencing homelessness. And one of the unique things I think about that fund, that one of the many things that Building Changes did well, was to convene a group of young people with lived experience of homelessness to ask them what the priorities should be, and then convert those priorities into a criteria system that would ultimately figure out who would get funded. A lot of people have come to that fund, as was just mentioned, people who, funders, institutional funders who were not funding in this area, who started to realize that this was a population that was hard hit by COVID. In fact, hard hit before COVID, have come to fund that, put money into that philanthropic fund, which has been delivered all throughout the state, through school districts, through their partners, and through service providers who work with students and youth experiencing homelessness. Another great thing about that is that it's really uncovered, at least probably not to the communities, but to the funders, a lot of grassroots organizations led by certainly, in many cases, people of color who were not on the radar of youth homelessness funders or public funders who funded in this area. And then third, we've had interest and are hopeful that public funders will put some of the stimulus funds through this fund, because what we've heard from them in certain situations is that they love the equitable and broad and immediate way that these funds are going out. And their staff have been deployed in other ways, in a way that they don't feel often they have the capacity to think about how to get funds out in a creative way. We want this fund, I think, as was mentioned earlier, this direct needs fund has to be something that highlights what the needs always were and how we're going to address them in a post-COVID landscape, what funding needs to look like, how the sectors need to coordinate and collaborate, and what are the specific needs of highly mobile populations. But at the same time, we're also, and we've been doing this for a while, we're supporting our partners to address how at the state level that stimulus funding that's coming down reaches students experiencing homelessness and other highly mobile populations. So we feel that supporting the advocacy work of our partners at the state and national level, we've been using our voice, our trustees' voice, to engage directly with decision makers, to remind them that this is a population that absolutely needs to be a specific part of the response around stimulus funds. And we, at the same time, we're trying not to pull back from support for structural change as well. We support Education Leads Home at the national level. We support SchoolHouse Washington at the state level. But we're also part of a 3-city national pilot to test how, if you combine universal testing for risk of homelessness as well as a multi-tiered system of support, can you actually prevent homelessness? And I think one of the things that has been clear, but has become much more clear through COVID, is that schools are in a unique position, not only to address student homelessness, but to prevent it, because they're seeing these students for hours and hours a day, and students trust teachers and bus drivers and PE teachers and others to know what's going on in their lives. And in fact, we owe it both to reduce to our students to reduce the likelihood of trauma, as well as we know that we can't accomplish our broad equity goals without thinking about prevention as well. So the Rakes Foundation is really pivoting in large part to thinking about prevention of youth homelessness, and we think that research is there to do this, to help do this at the national level as well as the state level. Lastly, I'd say a struggle for us, Celine, is that like many funders, we're struggling to balance the crisis response versus the long-term structural needs, things that need to be changed. And I think we feel that we have to stay in the fight to restructure how not only our schools, but our systems address student and youth homelessness. Otherwise, we will not only backtrack, we'll be back here in a couple of months. And this crisis, in all the terrible things that it's brought about, has certainly, I think, illuminated a number of different structural changes that could be changed, that could give us a much healthier school system and much healthier outcome for students experiencing homelessness.
That's incredibly helpful for others in the audience. For those of you, for our partners from SchoolHouse Connections, Building Changes, anything you want to add on these topics of, where do we go from here? What do we need advocacy around? What do we need funding around? How do we need to be thinking about the long-term and balancing long and short-term needs?
I think one thing that's really critical is just to think over the long term, how keeping a focus on students who are experiencing homelessness is going to get harder and harder. We have budget cuts that are draconian, that some states are discussing. And so the federal policy piece remains essential, to have a dedicated focus on these students who are experiencing homelessness and not lose sight of that as the state challenges become more dire. And again, that's so the maintaining and protecting the federal rules that we have, the provisions that we have, as well as really honing in on a dedicated funding stream to these students, because again, homelessness is not an identity, it's an experience that many, many students have. And the more vulnerable you are, the more disenfranchised you are, the furthest you are from opportunity, the more likely you are to experience homelessness. So it's a marker and a critical one to keep our focus.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'll add, and actually this is something that has been possible because of the philanthropic sector for us, which is supporting local and state advocacy. While we've talked a bit about the flexible funding, and that's absolutely critical, especially in kind of the response aspect of this, stabilizing and rebuilding is going to require really kind of intentional advocacy on students experiencing homelessness. And that's something that we've been, fortunate to be able to not only kind of build a coalition, but also mobilize the public. We've been able to kind of place, media to get public awareness and get a, call to action to our state agencies. And frankly, it's slow, but it's getting their attention. And we're hearing them actually, to, Liza's point of like, one of the bright spots here is we're actually hearing people talk about students experiencing homelessness and what is needed. And so I think as we think about kind of where we go from here, it's just continuing that slow drumbeat of the advocacy, recognizing that once we get past the immediate crisis and emergency response, we need to focus on the rebuilding a system, not in the same way that it was, because that wasn't working for our students, but in a way that actually best serves students experiencing homelessness.
And I'll add the specifics of the education services. So the online learning environment, I'm sure many people in our audience have children, and I think you spoke about this, Celine or Zoe, that it's just challenging. It's challenging, I think, for many, many students. And the idea that as school districts and school department and state departments of education are thinking through the fall and what it's going to look like, not to have classroom time, but to have, really, what is that going to look like for our highly mobile students? And it cannot be one size fits all. one of the things I've really experienced in the education system writ large is this idea of every student and just broad strategies. And what we know is that does not work for students experiencing homelessness. And it's really not going to work for the subpopulations within the population of students experiencing homelessness. So I think all of us are super concerned about what that online learning environment really, how is it going to be tailored to this group of students? That's one that really gives me pause.
That's helpful. So we're coming close to time. We have room for another question if anyone wants to add one. I'll wait time for a second. I'm very bad at wait time. But I want to ask, so we're ending on policy and advocacy in the future, which for me is always the right place to end. As we think about the different kind of levers for advocacy and the different levels of the system, where are you concentrating most of your effort right now? Is it districts and rural communities at that local level? Is it states? Is it the feds? All have their own kind of opportunities and challenges. How are you thinking about those and prioritizing your own time?
Yeah, for us in Washington, and I'm sure Barbara has a different perspective at the national level, but like for us, as we talked about the budget cuts, we have kind of very unique circumstance where we have an influx of new federal funding, and it's likely going to be the last kind of inflow of major education funding because we're facing such, substantial cuts in the future. And so for us, our focus has really been on the state level and the governor's office and our state education agency because they have the flexibility in how to use those dollars. And so our advocacy has been spent on providing recommendations on using those dollars. So we're asking for 25% of those dollars to be used for highly mobile students, including students experiencing homelessness. And so for us, it's at the state level, and it's around kind of mobilizing kind of the districts and the rural and the grassroots to support that state level advocacy.
And I'll just say ours goes, it's all of the above, but right now, obviously, we're focused on federal because Congress is working on this CARES 2.0 or whatever you want to call, however you're tracking the legislation. The CARES Act was a disappointment, frankly. Every other emergency supplemental, whether it was Hurricane Katrina or the storms in 2008 or 2017, had a dedicated focused line item for McKinneyVento, knowing that this was the pipeline. Congress went a different route with the CARES Act. So we think that dedicated line item in this next package is essential, as well as other protections, particularly for families and youth through flexible funding. So we're very focused on the congressional activity now, but then of course it moves to the states. So because the CARES Act was essentially a block grant in many respects to assist states, find out who's doing what, share that information among states. And then of course, when the dollars get to the local level, again, continue to do there. So it's really kind of in that order, just by virtue of where we are right now in this moment.
I think that's a great note to end on. So to all of those of you in philanthropy, empower your advocates and let's get good information to states and certainly the feds for the next stage of support. Thank you all. This was a really, really meaningful and I think illuminative conversation for a lot of people. So thank you, Liza. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Zoe. And we'll see you back here soon for another one of these, and we really appreciate your time. Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.